before I introduce today's guest, tell you about our sponsor's latest offer. The sponsor is the Great Courses Plus. It's an app you can get on your phone. You just tap it like that. Opens right up to a whole bunch of courses, hundreds and hundreds of courses, so thousands and thousands of lectures. The latest one I'm listening to here is Battles of World War II, the Pacific Theater. And here there's a total of 24 lectures. Each of them are about 29, 30 minutes. And this is the fun of this app, and the reason we're advertising them on the show. I'm not selling you pillows or anything like that. That, in fact, it's great intellectual content, and what I like about it is that you can skip around. So, for example, here are some of the lectures in this particular course: The Road to the War in the Pacific, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan moves south, the Doolittle raid on Japan, Midway, just skipping along here, Guadalcanal, the U.S. leaps to the Marianas, MacArthur returns to the Philippines, and then all the way down to Kamikaze Pilots, the battle for Okinawa, and then dropping the atomic bomb. Can't wait to listen to that one. So I've just started this course, and you should try it too. It's a great source of online digital content. If you access it through this show, you can get $30 off and for the annual plan, and that comes out to just $10 a month. So basically, that's 2.5 venti lattes at Starbucks for unlimited access to all this great knowledge. So to get the special offer through this show, that is $30 off the annual plan, comes out to $10 a month. Just go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer. Thanks for listening. My guest today is Martin Sherwin, and he is the author of the book that we're discussing, Gambling with Armageddon, about the Cuban Missile Crisis. He's also the author of A World Destroyed, the Atomic Bomb and the Grand Alliance, which won the Stuart L. Bernath Prize, as well as the American History Book Prize, and the co-author with Kai Bird of American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 2006. I read that book. It's a great book. He was the general editor of the Stanford University Press Nuclear Age series from 1985 to 2015, and is currently the general editor of the Johns Hopkins University Press Nuclear History and Contemporary Affairs series. As you can tell, he knows a lot about this subject. He and his wife live in Washington, D.C. and in Colorado. So, of course, we discussed the Cuban Missile Crisis, but much more than that, the kind of logic of deterrence and how that goes all the way back to the invention of nuclear weapons. And so that's why he begins in 1945. The subtitle of his book is Nuclear Roulette, From Hiroshima to the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1945 to 1962. So we go back to the division of Europe at Potsdam, and the division up of Germany and of Berlin into 4 sections, and that's why Berlin factors heavily into the Cuban Missile Crisis, because the tensions there were going to spill over into what might happen in Berlin. We also talk about the motives of Khrushchev to put nuclear weapons and missiles in Cuba in the first place. Definitely a defensive move to prevent the United States from orchestrating yet another invasion, a second invasion at the Bay of Pigs of Cuba. So from his perspective, that looked like a good move to put defensive weapons in there, even though obviously they can be used for offensive purposes. And so that gets us into the whole U.S.-USSR arms race. And also we discuss the arms race within the U.S. military, the arms race between the Air Force, Navy, and Army of who gets to control nuclear weapons because of their value and prestige and so forth. And then he walks us through the whole, day by day, almost hour by hour of how the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded from both Khrushchev's perspective and Kennedy's perspective, and how we really dodged a bullet, and luck does play a role in it. On many levels, the luck that we had Kennedy say instead of Nixon, or that it was Khrushchev instead of Stalin, or all the way down to the luck of the officer on the Soviet submarine there that could have launched a torpedo, nuclear-tipped torpedo, and destroyed many ships in the U.S. Navy that then would have launched another or a massive nuclear exchange. Anyway, so all this is super interesting material, mainly because it's still relevant. We still have over 10,000 nuclear weapons at the ready, or at least available to be made at the ready. Maybe half that are ready to be fired right now. So the problem isn't going to go away with a new American administration. That's never happened. The problem has always been there. And so we wrap up the conversation talking about how we can get, if we can't get to nuclear zero, which it certainly looks like it would be difficult to do, we can at least prevent Armageddon, which is the point of his book, Gambling with Armageddon. Since we were confronted with that and dodged that bullet, how did we do that? How can we do that again? So with that, I give you Marty Sherwin. Martin Sherwin, thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Michael. I appreciate it.
It's a great book. By the way, I read your Oppenheimer biography years ago. I think it was in the 90s. You gave a talk at Caltech when we were doing our public science lecture series there. I forget who you were in dialogue with. Maybe Dan Kevlis or one of the historians.
Actually, I wasn't. I remember that very well. It was a lecture in must have been 2005 or 2006.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Right. Well,
Yeah.
Well, that was a great biography. I love that book. I mean, Oppenheimer has to be one of the most interesting characters in all of history. That must have been fun to write that one.
No, it wasn't fun.
No?
It was agony because he was so complicated and, and the issues, at least to me, were so important, trying to get everything straight and, huge numbers of interviews and the book stretched out over 25 years and,
yeah.
Near the end, when my friend Kai Bird came by one evening and was sitting on a couch saying, "Oh, it's been 2 years since I wrote a book and I still can't figure out what to do next." I said, "Kai, I got an idea. Join me. I got to finish this."
Yeah.
And so, that finally got it done.
Yeah. Well, it was a great book, and your Gambling with Armageddon, subtitled Nuclear Roulette from Hiroshima to the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1945 to 1962. This is the best book I've read on this subject. In fact, it was so gripping. I did the audio. It's like 16 hours long or something. And it was like a John Grisham novel. I mean, I just couldn't stop listening because it's like, I already know what's going to happen, but it's like, I can't believe these guys are talking about this stuff. And because you had access, of course, to all the recordings, secret recordings that Kennedy made. But before we get into all that, Martin, I just wanted to ask you. I mean, you've lived a long life, and you've been, you're one of the most respected historians in America. How would you compare 2020 and last week to, I don't know, 1968 or Watergate or Vietnam or Korean War, the Cold War? Just pick some era that was traumatic. How would you compare what we've just gone through and are still going through to that?
Well, I don't think there's anything in the 20th century that we can compare it to. Certainly, not 1968, which was tough enough. And I'm reading a book right now on Watergate. Michael Dobbs, who also wrote about the Cuban Missile Crisis, very good book called 1 Minute to Midnight, I think back in 2007. He has a new book coming out called King Richard. So taking off from a Shakespearean framework, and it's about Watergate. And in some ways, it's sort of like Gambling with Armageddon in that it deals in a very detailed way with the devolution of Nixon's presidency from sort of day one of the Watergate break-in all the way to the very end. I'm not at the end of the book yet, but also very gripping. But I would say that, we're really dealing with sort of an Andrew Jackson period, a period before the Civil War, the worst parts of Reconstruction. I mean, it's very dangerous what we're involved with at the moment. It could spin out of control in a terrible right-wing direction. It could be contained. We don't know what's going to happen. I mean, this is not the end of it. Even if McConnell and McCarthy all jump on board and the Republicans say, or enough Republicans say, he should be impeached, and it's a bipartisan effort. There's still 74 million people out there who voted for him, and the majority of that 74 million, I think, are irrationally connected with him like a cult. And you know as well as I do that cults cannot be sort of talked out of their worst orientations through rational discussion.
Yeah, it's. I should put a pin on this that we're recording this on January 12th, so it's hard to say what will happen. I mean, but even if everything goes smooth and Biden takes over, and let's just say Trump just disappears into the mist, we still have all those nuclear weapons, and all the command and control system is still in place. And it's not just like with Obama. It's not like Biden's going to come in and institute no first use and no launch on warning and let's get to nuclear zero next year. That's not going to happen. Very unlikely. So we still have the problem that your book addresses, which is to say, how do we avoid Armageddon? And your epigram to your book, let me just read it here from Richard Nixon in 1974. I can go to my office and pick up a telephone, and in 25 minutes, millions of people will be dead. And so let me just extrapolate what that means exactly. We have, the United States has a triad of nuclear weapons. This comes from David Barish's new book on threats. The U.S. has a triad of nuclear weapons of land missiles, air bombers, and sea submarines. A single Trident sub carries 20 nuclear-tipped missiles, each of which has 8 independently targetable warheads of about 465 kilotons, or about 30 times the destructive power of Little Boy. So one submarine packs 20 times 8 times 30, which is 4,800 Hiroshimas. And we have 18 Trident submarines. So that's the equivalent of 86,400 Hiroshimas. In the words of President Obama during a briefing about our nuclear capability, let's stipulate that this is all insane. And so, I mean, what you're describing with the Cuban Missile Crisis, it could still happen. This could still happen. And so let's start there. The extent to which you talk about luck in your first chapter, the role of luck in human history in general, and in this particular case.
There's luck involved in everything. And as I say at some point at the beginning of the book, the whole sort of structure of our lives are built around luck in one way or another. I was lucky this book got into your hands. Now, that's very trivial. On the other hand, we were lucky that submarine captain, Savitsky, a Soviet submarine captain who, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, became convinced that the Americans were trying to sink his boat. He had a nuclear weapon on board, and he commanded that it be loaded, and he was going to shoot this American aircraft carrier out of the water with 4,000 or 5,000 Americans on it. And fortunately, luckily, there had been a disbursement of fleet commanders to the different submarines that were going to Cuba, and the best and probably only Soviet naval captain in that pool who would have stopped that attack on the American submarine was assigned quite randomly to Savitsky submarine. And that's why we're here talking. If Vasily Arkhipov had not been on that submarine, there would have been a nuclear war.
Do we know?
That's luck.
That is luck, yes. Do we know why he made the decision not to reinforce the captain's initial choice to launch the torpedo?
Well, he was a totally different kind of personality from the captain. The nickname, Savitsky's nickname among his colleagues was the sweater. Sweat,
Yeah.
Sweater.
I know what that's like.
He was a very tense guy.
Yeah.
And if Arkhipov was to be given a nickname, which he didn't have, he would be called the cool one.
Mm.
He was a very thoughtful and cautious and experienced, submariner. And he came to the conclusion that the Americans were not trying to sink the submarine, but were trying to force it to the surface and humiliate it, which was the case. And so he didn't go along with the order. And given the requirements of launching a nuclear weapon, his approval was necessary.
Yeah. So here I think maybe we're talking about contingency, the way things just unfold in a certain way, because I think colloquially luck has a certain meaning. So, but what you just described, it would be like saying we're lucky we had Kennedy instead of Nixon. Had Nixon won that another very close election, could have gone the other way. And then he's sitting in the ex-con meeting, and bomber, what's his name? Who was the commander of the United States Air Command? The guy that mass bombed Japan.
LeMay.
Yeah, General LeMay. Sorry, right. Spaced out there. And LeMay's pressing him, and of course Kennedy pushed back, but maybe Nixon, who was a little more hawkish than Kennedy, would have said, "Yeah, let's just bomb Cuba into the Stone Age, and down we go the rabbit hole to thermonuclear war." So it was, in that sense, it's lucky we had Kennedy instead of Nixon at that moment. Is that also what you mean by luck, in the more global sense?
Yeah, that's a luck once removed, in the sense that there was an election process. What happened with the Soviet submarine was that somebody was just randomly selected. You're going with this submarine. Another member of the fleet command was going with the other submarine, and so on and so forth. That's I think that's a little bit different. But there were also there's a story I tell about the Okinawa situation.
Right. I had never heard that one. That's
not a. Yeah, well, it's not. It was kind of a news story, so to speak. It was discovered, I think, only about a few years ago by this very excellent Japanese reporter, it was the same sort of thing. There was a colonel on duty, a captain on duty at the time, who was a very thoughtful, cautious person. And he prevented an erroneous order to fire the missiles from Okinawa at Russian and Chinese targets. It was crazy. Why are we firing missiles at China? He said, this doesn't make any sense. And he stopped it.
Yeah. Marty, just turn your email off, because we're getting the ping from your incoming emails. And if you can do that, just do quit, and then and then tilt your computer screen down just like an inch or half an inch down a little bit. Yeah, here though there is some luck there, although in that case, and also in the case of Petrov, the so-called man who saved the world in 1984. There's an element of reason and rationality. I mean, Petrov reasoned that, 5 blips on the radar screen, if the United States is going to launch a first strike, they're not going to send 5 missiles. It's going to be massively more than that. And your guy in Okinawa is thinking, well, why would we be fighting the Chinese? That doesn't even make sense. So there I would credit to reason and rationality and intelligence.
Yes, but lucky that Petrov was there.
Yes,
he wasn't even supposed to be the guy on duty. There was he was filling in for someone, and that was lucky.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
So
right.
I mean, there are all kinds of different sorts of luck. There's a French analyst, a French historian, Benoit Pelopaitis, who is writing and has written and is writing a whole series of articles analyzing nuclear luck.
Oh, right.
And it's it's some of it's very technical. A lot of it is, most of it is, very interesting. And he's just looking at luck as the centerpiece of our survival.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's true. And if I can just make one big global statement about that, and I was thinking about this when I wrote my book on the Holocaust. There's this meme, no Hitler, no Holocaust. And I think that's right. Even though anti-Semitism was pretty rampant in Europe and particularly in Germany, I don't think it was exterminationist anti-Semitism to the extent that the Nazis carried it out. No Hitler, no Holocaust. And then I've read some World War II historians saying, no Hitler, no World War II, that maybe that never would have happened, and therefore no nuclear weapons, because we never would have invented nuclear weapons just for the hell of it, right? It was mainly initially because of the fear of the Germans were doing it.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, that's true.
So that's some pretty big luck, bad luck in that case, that we end up going down this particular pathway. But once you start there, and the other thing I really liked about your book is giving us some insights into Khrushchev and what the Russians were thinking. And then it becomes like, okay, I'm going to take the other guy's perspective and see what it is they were thinking. So you take us back into time to the Bay of Pigs and in the 1950s and the tensions with American and Cuban relations after the revolution there and so on. And then it kind of makes sense why Khrushchev sent missiles there. America was threatening to invade again, and we had already organized an invasion. A little bit like, the so-called madman Kim Jong-un. What's he doing with nuclear weapons? Well, we know if a country has nuclear weapons, America doesn't mess with you as much as if you don't. So if you want to have a chair at the table with the big boys and you want to get respect and be left alone, nuclear weapons is one way to go.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. And in a sense, it's exact same thinking that occurred at the very beginning of the nuclear age. When the nuclear weapon came to fruition, as you know, the first test was on July 16th, 1945 at Alamogordo. The American leadership, Truman and his Secretary of State, James Burns especially, they looked at Europe and said, in the post-war period, we're at a real disadvantage. The Soviets have all these millions of boots on the ground. They're not going anywhere. We're going to be bringing our troops, back from Europe. This nuclear weapon has a balancing opportunity. So Henry Stimson at the Potsdam Conference, when he presented the information about the successful test of Truman, he called it the Great Equalizer. So we saw ourselves at that time as the underdog with respect to controlling things in Europe. But with the nuclear weapon, we now were, it was the great equalizer. We were the Soviet boots on the ground were now nullified by our monopoly of nuclear weapons. Move ahead to the Eisenhower administration. He comes into office, and the Korean War is still going on, and he's worried about the economy and spending a lot of money on sending troops overseas. And he says, "Aha! I have the answer. We're going to rely on our nuclear advantage." And he develops massive retaliation and brinksmanship. And when he comes into office, there are, I think it was 1,200 nuclear weapons in 1953 in the American arsenal. 7 years later, or 7.5 years later, when he leaves office, there were 22 or 23,000
Wow.
nuclear weapons
Right.
in the American arsenal. He promoted nuclear weapons as what he thought was the cheap way to get, this absolute security. Well, on the other side of the world, we have Nikita Khrushchev, who takes over after Stalin's death in March 1953, right about when Eisenhower comes in, by the way. And it takes a couple of years for Khrushchev to solidify his position in the Soviet Union. And he looks at what Eisenhower's doing, and he says, well, I can do the same thing. In fact, that would be cheap security for me, too. I can get more nylons for better food for my people, if I can reduce the size of the military. And then he follows the exact blueprint that Eisenhower followed. Then a little later on, and we're talking now about 1958 or so, 1959, Khrushchev has launched Sputnik in October 1957. And how does the United States respond? Europe is very tense. The Americans are tense. If they can stick a satellite up in the fly around the world, well, they can put a nuclear weapon on that rocket that launched the satellite. So on that missile. So Eisenhower says, okay, I'm going to deploy nuclear weapons to Europe in order to make my allies feel more secure. So we have Jupiter missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, in Turkey, 130 miles from the Soviet Union. In Italy, there's Thor missiles in Britain. And in 1962, after the Bay of Pigs, when Khrushchev and Castro have become convinced that the United States is going to do it right the next time, that is, the American military is going to attack, Khrushchev says, how can I save my new best friend? Eisenhower has the answer, gave me the answer. I'm going to stick those same missiles Eisenhower put in Turkey in Cuba. And that'll do two things. It'll keep Castro secure, because the United States isn't going to attack Cuba if it knows that, that might end up in launching a missile against New York and Washington, et cetera, et cetera. And also it'll help me balance the number of nuclear weapons the United States between the Soviet Union and the United States. So this is great. Okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to sneak them in there. And boy, once I announce they're ready to go, Kennedy is going to be in a pretty tough situation, the same tough situation I was in when they put those missiles in Turkey. So it's back and forth. And, the thinking, it's, North Koreans, Pakistanis, Chinese, it's all the same. And we're in a box. I mean, you're talking about how do we get out of this box? and nobody
Yeah,
knows.
because this is what security people call the security dilemma or the other guy problem. I don't want them, but the other guy might have them, so I gotta have them. So there's a kind of a perverse logic to it, and again, you kind of reconstruct exactly what was going on in the mind of both leaders. And that Bay of Pigs thing, I hadn't read that much on the details of it. Just to be clear for everybody, these were not American troops that invaded Cuba. These were Cuban nationalists that were overseas and trained by the CIA to invade, right? And we were going to back them up with air power or something like that.
Well, no, uh, the United States, was not going to back them up, visibly back them up at all. The CIA did supply them with air power. Uh, with I think they were B-17s or B-26s. Um, uh, and uh, so that was part of the plan, which ended up getting um, trashed for various complicated reasons. The Bay of Pigs is an incredibly interesting story about how Eisenhower sort of foisted it on Kennedy. But Kennedy was, if it worked, Kennedy was very happy to get rid of Castro. He had campaigned on the failure of the Republicans to get rid of Castro, and by God, the Kennedys can do it. But he didn't like this plan that was presented to him, and he warned the CIA. He said, "Look," and Eisenhower did the same thing, by the way. Said, "Look, this has to be something that has no American fingerprints on it." Now, of course, that was impossible, but there shouldn't be too many fingerprints, so to speak. And Kennedy said, there is going to be absolutely no backup by American troops and American air power. The CIA, you have to understand, but nobody believed them. How can an American president, not send troops in to this embarrassing situation if everything is falling apart? And it was so important to understand, in my view, that Kennedy had the backbone to take the hit, the political hit. He said he wasn't going to do it, and he didn't do it, and he faced the worst day of his life. And, this is a guy who almost died a few times because of his various illnesses. But the Bay of Pigs, April 17th, 18th, 1961, was one of the worst days of Kennedy's life. But he sucked it up, and and a couple of days later, he came out there and he said this famous phrase: "Victory has 100 fathers, and defeat is an orphan." And I'm the responsible.
Yeah, that does take a
I'm the
lot of
responsible
intellectual
guy.
character to take the blame for that. When in fact, and I didn't realize the extent to this, the plan was in Eisenhower's administration. Kennedy just inherited it.
That's correct.
I mean,
That's correct.
Kennedy could have
And
just said
Eisenhower,
Kennedy could have just said this was Eisenhower's problem. I just followed through and shuffled the responsibility off that way, but he didn't.
right? No, it's true. In any way, you know, Kennedy's behavior at the Bay of Pigs is the great insight, in my view, into this man's the strength of his character, his backbone. And when you move on to the Cuban Missile Crisis, you see that the very first day, very first meeting that they have on the crisis, Kennedy is going along with all his advisors. Yeah, we're going to have to bomb. We're going to have to invade. That's the only way we're going to be able to get rid of those missiles. And I think and I hope others who read the book think, it is absolutely fascinating to watch him shift from that position to the position where he is willing to do almost anything to prevent an action that could lead to nuclear war.
What do you think caused that trigger, that shift?
Well, I think, first of all, there was time to think.
Yeah.
Second of all, Kennedy was a deep thinker. He thought about consequences. Third of all, and in my view, very important, the very first day after the very first meeting, which was 11:30 on Tuesday, October 16th. After that meeting, there was a luncheon at which Adlai Stevenson, the American ambassador to the United Nations, was present. They had a previous appointment. Again, by luck, Stevenson was in New York normally, but he came down that day, had a meeting at the State Department, and had arranged to have lunch with the president to go over various things. Kennedy takes him upstairs to the family room and shows him these photographs that McGeorge Bundy had just showed him about 4 or 5 hours ago that the U-2 had taken the day before of the Soviet missile sites that were being built in Cuba. And Kennedy says, well, it looks like we're going to have to bomb or even invade Cuba to get rid of these missiles. We can't tolerate them. And Stevenson says, who has a very different view, oh, no. This can be done diplomatically. And he outlines right off the top of his head, what needs to be, done diplomatically. You don't want to lead with, bombing. You want to make it clear that negotiation of missile sites and ours in Europe, theirs in Cuba, are all negotiable. This is, in a sense, he doesn't say this, but there's a way of understanding this. This is an opportunity to move our desire to minimize nuclear weapons. In negotiations, we can, engage the Soviets on that. They have a handle, we have a handle. Let's, sort of move each other's handles. And he has a totally different view than Kennedy. And we know all of this because the next day he wrote up a memo of their discussion and sends it to Kennedy. Kennedy absorbs this over the next couple of days. And that blueprint that Stevenson laid out, which is fascinating, becomes the blueprint that Kennedy follows without attribution, because he doesn't like Stevenson at all. And
remind us that Adlai Stevenson ran against Kennedy in the primaries?
Oh, well, Adlai Stevenson and Kennedy had a very unpleasant relationship, let's say. Adlai Stevenson was the Democratic candidate for president in 1952, lost in a landslide to Eisenhower. But he was also the presidential candidate for the Democrats in 1956. And Kennedy wanted to be the vice president. And Stevenson resisted that. He did not think Kennedy, he thought of Kennedy as a playboy. And he was a playboy. And he didn't take Kennedy very seriously. So he rejected him as vice president. And boy, Robert Kennedy and Jack Kennedy really were angry about that. Then in 1960, when Kennedy is about to be nominated by the Democrats, the Stevenson group within the Democratic Party at the convention starts, a movement. We want Stevenson. We want Stevenson. We want Stevenson. And the whole convention floor is exploding with this Stevenson enthusiasm. And Kennedy is very angry because he thinks that Stevenson encouraged this. And I would say he didn't discourage it. um, and see, Stevenson represents the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, and Kennedy is in the middle. And the liberals trust Kennedy. Anyway, Kennedy does become, obviously, the Democratic candidate. He wins the election. He's got to keep Stevenson in the tent because he is such a significant figure within the left wing of the Democratic Party. Stevenson wants to be Secretary of State. Kennedy's not going to hear of that. He offers him the ambassadorship to the UN. Stevenson reluctantly takes it. And talk about luck. It's a good thing he took it because, Stevenson ends up supplying this blueprint for the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But, you have to add one other thing. He could have supplied that blueprint to Richard Nixon, who would have totally rejected it. Kennedy was a thinker. And that's one of the wonderful things about having the minutes, the record, not the minutes, the actual words, the secret recordings of these ex-com meetings. You see Kennedy thinking differently in the discussions from the rest of his advisors. He just had a different approach. From the very first, he says, he's the only one who says this, and he says it again and again as things begin to evolve. He says, we got to think about why Khrushchev did this. Why did he do such a crazy thing? He knew it was dangerous. What is he thinking? And he always wanted to know what the other guy was thinking, not just what the other guy did and what we're going to do to counter the other guy.
Yeah, the principle of interchangeable perspectives. You got to put yourself in the other guy's mind to figure out what's going on and why they would do what they did. By the way, on a parenthetical note, one of the things we do at Skeptic Magazine, my day job, is debunk conspiracy theories like crazy QAnon, the one that's popular now. But, one of the explanations I have for why people believe conspiracy theories is that some of them are true. Like the shenanigans of the United States in the 70s supporting 60s and 70s supporting South American dictators that had more friendly support of American interests rather than the communist dictators. And we're, the CIA's down there manipulating elections. But my favorite one is the Operation Northwoods that came out, I think, in the late 90s, in which somebody in Kennedy's administration brought to him this plan of how we're going to get Castro and have an excuse to invade Cuba by... It was like doctoring up an American jet to look like a Russian MiG and then fly it over Miami. And then we'll chase it and pretend that this was an invasion. And then we'll tell the American people we have to counter. And of course, and they had all kinds of things like, poisoning Castro's wetsuit because he was a scuba diver, and poison pen and like a conch at the bottom of the ocean with a bomb in it when he scuba dived down. And Kennedy, to his credit, rejected all these crazy conspiracy theories. But that someone in the U.S. government high up actually thinks...
Let me just throw in, because I think Northwoods is really important. That was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Oh, my God, that high up.
Developed that. And... the worst thing, in my view, in Operation Northwoods was we can have a plane that has all the markings of the Cuban Air Force shoot down a passenger liner.
Oh, right.
An American passenger liner with college students on their way to, Cancun or something like that. I mean, it was just crazy, absolutely crazy. And as you said, Kennedy, rejected. He also got rid of that particular Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman. Chairman.
But that's an idea of a false flag operation that you often hear in conspiratorial talk. Anyway, yeah, that's oh boy. The other thing that comes up a lot in your book. Oh wait, I was going to pinpoint that thing about Adlai Stevenson at the UN, because you reconstruct that great scene, and you can actually watch it on YouTube. I think it's available, that black and white video of it, where he confronts the Russian ambassador and says, "Don't wait for the translator. I'm going to wait here till hell freezes up." I mean, he was great at that moment. Oh my God.
Yeah, I mean that was kind of it was a very funny moment. It was something just Stevenson blurted out when he says to Zorin, "Don't wait for the translation, yes or no. Do you have weapons in Cuba?" And of course, that was very funny. But of course, he said it because he knew that Zorin understood the English.
By the way, and on a related topic, this idea of the team of rivals, where it's good to have people on a committee or in the room with you, or in any kind of corporate or government agency of any kind, that it's good to have people that disagree with one another. So you have a diversity of opinions. And so in this case, it seems like Adlai Stevenson, who Kennedy didn't particularly like, good to have that point of view, and that did change his thinking.
Yes, but he was not actually a regular member of the XCOM. He was, again, we were lucky he was there that first day. Then after that, he came down a few days, but of course he was very busy in the UN, and he was promoting the idea of negotiating sort of everything to avoid nuclear war. And Kennedy's group of advisors, which were called for nickname was XCOM. It was the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. That was the name that was given to the people he gathered to advise him. Were for the most part really hawks. They went back and forth. McNamara, watching McNamara bounce back and forth between saying some of the most sensible things to saying some of the most dangerous and irresponsible things, and Robert Kennedy, very much the same. It's fascinating, to see how the tension of this really existential moment, it led some people to very, very bad, giving very, very bad advice.
Yeah.
Whereas Stevenson and Ambassador Thompson, and George Ball, were more steady.
Another subject that comes up a lot in your reconstruction of those meetings is Berlin. So give us a brief history of how Berlin became a central focal point with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, well, as a matter of fact, there's a wonderful Walter Cronkite news program during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think on the second day of the public crisis. Maybe I should just back up for your audience and explain that the first day of the crisis is October 16th on Tuesday. And from October 16th to October 22nd, the crisis exists only within the American government. It's very secret. We haven't informed the Soviets that we know about this. Kennedy and his advisors trying to decide, what they're going to do. So that's phase one. That's the American crisis. October 22nd, 7 o'clock at night, Kennedy makes his speech, explains that we're going to blockade Cuba. And now we have the second week, the public week, the real crisis, where Khrushchev and Kennedy are really pulling on both ends of the rope, to use a phrase
Khrushchev's phrase.
Khrushchev came up. Yeah. So, during that crisis, there are, lots of different things going on. And there's really, panic within the, at various periods among the American advisors. And things are just kind of sort of coming apart. And at this point, Kennedy begins to focus in and to understand that there has to be a way out of this, as Stevenson argued there was, and he was going to find it, and he was not going to allow the Joint Chiefs of Staff or his advisors to force him into doing something that killed a lot of Russians and would force Khrushchev to do something bad. Now, you asked about Berlin. So how does Berlin get into this? And I said there was this Walter Cronkite program where one of the national reporters is saying the center of this crisis is Berlin. And Cronkite says, "What do you mean Berlin? It's Cuba." and the reporter says, "I have been briefed by anonymous sources to point out that Berlin is the issue." And Cronkite said, "How can Berlin be the issue?" But here was the way they thought about it, the way the president thought about it. For the last 4 years, Khrushchev has been pressing first Eisenhower and then Kennedy to get American, French, and British troops out of West Berlin and to rationalize, in Khrushchev's view, the division of Germany. What are American troops doing 80 miles or 40 miles, into East Germany? This is dangerous. And, so he's trying to get those troops out of there. In fact, it becomes an obsession. Rusk says at one point, Khrushchev is probably irrational about Berlin. So they think putting the missiles in Cuba, which will threaten the United States, are there not to protect Castro, but to give Khrushchev more leverage to threaten the United States to withdraw from Berlin. So Kennedy begins to, it's all very logical. It happens to be wrong, but it's very logical. And, Kennedy says, look, if we blockade Cuba, this is going to give Khrushchev the excuse to blockade Berlin. But it's the least aggressive action we can take, so we have to take that chance. But if we attack Cuba, well, then Khrushchev will really have the opportunity or the excuse to attack West Berlin. So everything that we do in this crisis, this Cuban Missile Crisis, relates to how Khrushchev is going to respond to our actions in Europe, not just in Cuba, but in Europe, in Berlin. And there's a Friday afternoon meeting, it's October 19th, during the secret part, before the speech on the 22nd, where Kennedy meets with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And they are telling him, he's got to invade, he's got to bomb and all of this. And he says, look, let me tell you what it's like from my point of view. And he explains, this Berlin situation. And, he analyzes it for them. and says, you know, basically, we're not 100% certain about this, but if this actually happens, we're going to lose our Berlin. We're going to be responsible for it. This is uh, the fulcrum around which the NATO alliance has been turning since Truman, refused to, collapse and accept Stalin's blockade. The Berlin airlift, 1948. So, Kennedy is focused on Berlin as much as he is focused on Cuba.
Yeah.
If not more.
And that goes back to Potsdam, right? When the heads of state met to divide up Germany and decide who's going to get what. And I forget why Berlin ended up, I guess because it was the capital divided up into four sections of which each of the four powers would run. But Berlin is, what you said, 180 miles into East Germany. So that it really goes back to 1945 right there.
Yeah, I'm not sure of how I've forgotten. I think 180 miles is a little exaggeration, but it's over 100 miles into East Germany, but Berlin was the great prize, the symbolic prize of
for Stalin.
So the Americans, wanted a presence there, and the French and the British, and it was a very, very bad move when you think of it. So what are some principles that come out of that? Don't put yourself into vulnerable situations, just for, propaganda purposes. I mean, that's what it was all about. Sticking yourself in the middle of Soviet territory, being totally vulnerable, just created a whole dynamic that was very, very dangerous during the Cold War.
Have you ever been to the World War II Museum in Moscow? They don't call it that. They call it like the War of Liberation or something like that. I mean, it's massive. I walked through it, and you really get the sense that these guys, the Russians, I mean, they suffered way more than all the Allies combined. And so you kind of see from their perspective why they feel like they should have had, more of the territory when the war was over.
Yeah, no, absolutely. 4/5 of the Wehrmacht, Hitler's army, 4/5 were on the Eastern Front. The United States and Britain fought 1/5 of the Wehrmacht.
Wow.
The Russians fought 4/5. No, it was just an incredible, devastating war for the Russians, and it wasn't any fun for the Americans. But our territory never got occupied, so it was two totally different experiences.
Yeah,
and out of those experiences, a lot of the history that followed after 1945 evolved, and and the nuclear issue is very much tied into that.
Yeah, your description of the complexity of NATO and our support for our allies there brings me up to Obama's attempt to institute no first use, but that got blocked by our allies in NATO, right? They said if you go to no first use, then what's going to stop Putin from coming in or doing something like that? And you can't. In other words, it changes the deterrence equation, and that goes all the way back to the 1950s.
That's correct. It does. We not only have had a first use policy, but we initiated the first use policy. I mean, right. Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right.
We're talking about second use here.
Right.
But to be analytical about this, yes, if you are relying on nuclear weapons as the foundation of your defense. First use policy, makes a lot of sense. But that is just the beginning of the discussion. It can't be the end. What are the implications of that? We've talked about how Khrushchev copied, Eisenhower in terms of massive retaliation. If you look around the world at all those nations that have nuclear weapons, perhaps with the exception of Israel, who uses its nuclear weapons in a slightly different way, they're all copying what the United States did. Well, Israel's doing the same thing. I mean, sort of, it's the great equalizer, for them, just as it is for Kim Jong-un and for anybody else. It's a situation where you're working yourself into a box that you can't get out of, and the box one day can explode. We started off talking about luck. What happened? I watched one of your earlier programs, the one with Fred Kaplan, and and I think he said something which I totally agree with. He says a lot of things I totally agree with, but this particular one, it was if we have a smart leader and good luck, that's why we haven't had, sort of nuclear war until now. But what happens when we have a leader who's not so smart and our luck is not so good? It's going to go away. And that's the box that we're in. And I don't believe in inevitability, but I do believe in probabilities. And the probability is higher and higher that nuclear weapons will be used if we don't get rid of them.
Yeah, we don't want to give the Nobel Peace Prize to the nuclear weapons because we haven't had a major war since 1945. That would not be a good move. Yeah, Kaplan's got this it's not funny story, but there was some Air Force base deep in Siberia that's only open like 3 months out of the year because it's frozen otherwise. And the United States had 200 nuclear weapons targeted on that grassy field. Just the overkill. And then another point that David Barish makes is not just the arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States, but the arms race within the United States between the departments, the various military departments. The Air Force, they have a bomb. Okay, well, the Navy, we got to get in on that because then it comes down to sort of defending your fiefdom. And to defend your fiefdom, you need a budget. You got to pay your employees, and so you got to have the government giving you allocating some funds, and so you got to justify that. So they're justifying bombing targets in order to keep producing nuclear weapons, in order to keep the budget, in order to keep their fiefdom going. And that just sounds crazy, but that's kind of how it works.
Yeah. No, that's exactly how it works. That's exactly how it works. The Air Force Navy competition especially is critical, and the Strategic Air Command was the strategic advertising agency command during the Eisenhower administration. And past that, they were able to constantly make the case that we need more and more weapons. Well, more weapons, more planes, and the biggest threat to the Air Force was the United States Navy. They got the Polaris submarines you talked about at the beginning of our discussion. Now, think about this. If the Soviets or somebody, Chinese, Koreans, I don't know, whatever, if we see missiles coming in, or what we take to be missiles, what are they targeted at? They're targeted perhaps at cities, but they're targeted at our intercontinental ballistic missiles, Minutemen, and so forth and so on. And the thinking back in the Dr. Strangelove days of the early 60s and the 50s was that it was absolutely critical to launch our missiles out of those silos before they were destroyed, right? Now, what if it was a mistake? Well, if it's a mistake, as General Turgidson would say, well, everybody makes mistakes or something like that. Sorry about that. But there is absolutely no need at all to launch against incoming missiles. Think about this. Why? First of all, launching against incoming missiles is not going to stop the missiles from hitting their targets. What you want to do, I suppose, is to retaliate against an attack. Well, you just described at the beginning of our discussion very clearly that we have Polaris submarines, which are invulnerable now, that can take out, everything that we want to take out. Why would you take the chance on launching against an alleged suspected incoming when it could be a mistake? And when, that launch has nothing to... The point is that the Air Force is irrelevant when, in the Polaris, age. But my God, if there's somebody in Colorado Springs listening to this podcast, and I just said the Air Force is irrelevant, and, SAC was, the Strategic Air Command, or what used to be called TRITA, is irrelevant. I mean, I should be impeached or something. Hey, you can't say anything worse, from the point of view of the Air Force. But that's the way it is now. But they're not willing to, give up these missile commands. They're just, they're a waste of money. They're dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah, another one of my favorite examples I've used on this podcast before is Edward Snowden's appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast, which goes on for like 3.5 hours. And so they get into the weeds of everything. And, Joe's really into conspiracy theories. So he's asking about this conspiracy theory or that conspiracy theory. And Ed Snowden says, let me tell you how it works. It's just a bunch of bureaucrats trying to keep their jobs. And they got to keep the terrorism threat level high in order to keep their budgets high for their particular departments, because we got this threat. And if we have no threat, what are we doing? And so it's kind of a conspiracy, but it's a little more mundane and less sexy. Anyway, I always like that story. A couple of quotes from Dr. Strangelove. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, even Hannah Arendt said about, the Holocaust, Eichmann in Jerusalem, the ordinariness of evil.
Right.
It's, these basic human sort of instincts for ambition and advantage, just take over.
Right. Wasn't there a moment in Reykjavik where Gorbachev told Reagan, when Reagan said, what are you afraid of? We're afraid of you. We're afraid you're going to invade us and try to destroy us. And Reagan's like, we don't want to do any of that. Why would you think that? And it's like, because of the last 50 years. And, sort of a perspective thing. You mentioned Dr. Strangelove. This is one of my favorite movies. I like that moment where Strangelove explains the point of deterrence. Deterrence is the art of producing in the mind of the enemy the fear to attack. Said enemy, of course, must know that you have
the fear.
The whole point of a doomsday machine is lost if you keep it a secret. So you get, So that gets back to your point where Khrushchev was going to announce that it wasn't a secret. It was only a secret to get him set up and ready to go. Then you announce, we got these. Now I have a position for bargaining. Okay, so I know I was going to ask you. So let's go back to your story. So Kennedy gives his speech. Did Khrushchev not know that we knew until that moment when Kennedy gives that public speech?
Well, he knew an hour before. Kennedy sent a letter to the American embassy for delivery to Khrushchev an hour before his speech. Explaining what was going to happen. And one of the interesting scenes in the book about Khrushchev is, sort of what's going on when Khrushchev hears that Kennedy is going to give a speech at 7:00. He's terrified. He said, "Oh my God, they found out about the missiles and they're going to announce that they're invading Cuba. We didn't want to start a war. All we wanted to do was pressure the United States. All we wanted to do was save Castro. What are we going to do? This is horrible." And they are in a total panic. And then when they read the letter and hear Kennedy's, speech, they're totally relieved. Oh my God. He's only going to blockade. So he doesn't want a war. So now I can be tough.
That's
so
funny.
Khrushchev goes from terror to to taking for a few days this effort to counter. Counter. Kennedy.
You mentioned blockade. I'm reminded of George Orwell's 1946 essay, "Politics in the English Language." Wasn't there a moment in your book where they said, well, we can't call it a blockade because technically that's an act of war in the UN definition of war. So give us another word. Okay, quarantine. This is really so funny how the words make a difference.
Right. Well, they were all very proud of themselves. So, we're not saying blockade, we're saying quarantine. That's very clever. Well, Khrushchev in his first letter to Kennedy writes, this is piracy. This is a blockade. And the interesting thing is that during most of the ex-com discussions about the quarantine, the people who are discussing it call it a blockade. So,
right.
It's a blockade, and Khrushchev knows it's a blockade. And if he wanted to start a war over an illegal action that the United States took, or an act of war that the United States took, he had a good excuse. But war was the last thing that Khrushchev wanted to happen. And fortunately, war was the last thing that Kennedy, wanted to happen. And where luck comes in is that despite the fact that these two leaders did not want a war, there were things happening on the ground, so to speak, that could have precipitated a war.
Yeah.
For example, the unauthorized shoot down of an American U-2 on Saturday, October 27th, the day before the crisis ended. A Soviet missile crew is alerted that a U-2 is flying from one end of Cuba to the other. It's going to be over its part of Cuba very soon. They try to contact the commander. The commander is not available. And so the Soviet senior officer at that surface-to-air missile site decides we're going to take down that plane. Castro had been badgering the Soviets, shoot those damn things down. What are all the equipment for? And they shoot it down. And Khrushchev gets the word. What is going on? I didn't authorize this. Things are coming apart.
Yeah.
And then that night, Castro sends him a letter and tells him if the United States invades Cuba, which he's certainly they're going to do, that Khrushchev should fire his missiles at the United States in a preemptive strike. And Khrushchev says, "Oh my God, Castro doesn't understand. This is not to start a war. This was to protect Cuba." And he very quickly, Khrushchev very quickly moves to bring the crisis to an end.
Yeah, I wasn't aware.
The Jupiter Missile.
Right. I wasn't aware until I read your book that Castro and Khrushchev had some tensions there that way. I also like the scene where Kennedy asks, I think it's LeMay, what do you think the Soviets will do when we bomb their missile sites and we kill a bunch of their soldiers? And LeMay says, nothing. And Kennedy's like, nothing? Nothing? What would we do?
Yeah. No, Kennedy is just, astonished at, LeMay's attitude. LeMay is, well, the whole Joint Chiefs of Staff, LeMay, Anderson, the CNO, Wheeler, all of them, these are World War II generals who have, in the 17 years between the end of World War II and the Cuban Missile Crisis, moved to the most senior levels of the military service. Their frame of reference, their understanding of how the world works, is a product of their World War II experience. How did we defeat the Germans and the Japanese? We bombed them and we bombed them. And, we just, war, they all agree war is terrible. That none of them are, none of them prefer war. But if you have war, you've got to go all out and you've got to just smash everything. And that's why nuclear weapons become so attractive to these guys. Well, if I'm going to smash something with a little hand hammer, that's one thing. But if you give me a sledgehammer to do it, boy, I can do a lot more damage a lot quicker, and make whatever point I want to make, quicker. And so, unfortunately, what we have in 1962 in the Joint Chiefs of Staff is this World War II mentality transferred into the nuclear age, where, the consequences of making a mistake are existentially disastrous. And so, fortunately, we have John Kennedy, who was a military skeptic as a result of his experience during World War II, in the presidency, who ends up keeping these guys under control.
Yeah, the existential response. Again, to bring it back to the present, that's why Obama didn't do anything when Putin sent his nondescript uniformed troops into the Crimea. And, Obama said, well, we're drawing a line in the sand, and that was really bad, and you shouldn't do that, and don't do that again. But he's not going to use his nukes to stop that.
Yeah. Well, in a very real sense, as George Shultz and Perry and Sam Nunn and
Kissinger,
even Kissinger said in Wall Street letter back in, I think it was 2006 or 2007, nuclear weapons are useless, today for the United States. I mean, how are we going to use nuclear weapons? And as I point out in Gambling with Armageddon, it's nuclear weapons that create the crises that they are intended, to prevent.
That's such a great line.
It's a circle.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Here's the quote from McNamara. Mutual assured destruction is the foundation of deterrence. Nuclear weapons have no military utility whatsoever, excepting only to deter one's opponent from their use, which means you should never initiate their use against a nuclear-equipped opponent. If you do, it's suicide. Yeah. Okay, so now who was the equivalent of a LeMay or hardliners or hawks that were pressing Khrushchev, and how did he resist that pressure?
Well, I don't think there was anyone in the Kremlin who was as hawkish as LeMay. But Malinowski, the Minister of Defense, had a very strong sort of view. But remember, the Soviets understood that they were at a disadvantage with respect to the nuclear balance, and the last thing the Soviets wanted 17 years after the end of World War II, which destroyed their country, and they're doing their best to build it back up, was another war.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not looking for wars. And also, Cuba is, a long way from Moscow, and it's not the same. So there really is no equivalent. I mean, the Soviets are much more cautious in their discussions than the Americans are, or at least certainly the Joint Chiefs. But Khrushchev is, sort of playing the game. I mean, this is, sort of nuclear poker, so to speak. And he's bluffing. And he bluffs and he bluffs. And finally, he gets to the point where he says, I'm going to lose everything. And he folds. And that's on Sunday afternoon in Moscow. He writes a letter saying that he will accept Kennedy's pledge not to invade Cuba, and that ends it. But there was a secret negotiation that led to the removal of the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. Those missiles really bothered Cuba. They were I'm sorry. It really bothered Khrushchev. It's not that they were not vulnerable. They were junk, as Kennedy said, but they were this symbol of American arrogance from the point of view of Khrushchev, right on the Soviet Union's, border, having these, intermediate range nuclear missiles.
So was that secret deal it was secret on the American side? Did Khrushchev tell his people, in addition to promising not to invade Cuba, they're also going to take these missiles out? Or was that a secret on their end also?
Well, Khrushchev was not the only one who knew about that. But he certainly did not, it didn't go beyond the circle that knew about this deal. Of course, Ambassador Dobrynin knew about it. Of course, Bobby Kennedy had, made the arrangement through Dobrynin. And one of the most interesting questions, and historians are always asking this, why did Khrushchev not reveal that he had forced Kennedy to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey? Now, Robert Kennedy had explained to Dobrynin that the president will have those missiles out within a couple of months, but it has nothing to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And if you reveal this commitment on our part, we will deny it, and we will, we'll end up leaving missiles there. So, my view is that Khrushchev had already lied to Kennedy to get saying that only defensive, weapons were being Cuba. He had fractured the relationship that they had built up and that he wanted to maintain. To have revealed this for his own purposes would have further and irreparably, fractured any future relationship with the United States. Now, Khrushchev did not know that he was going to be thrown out of office within a year. He saw, many years of working with Kennedy. Kennedy was in only his second year of what Khrushchev assumed would likely be an 8-year presidency. And he needed, to work with him. And so he just kept that secret, a secret.
Interesting. And when did the American public become aware of that deal, the Jupiter missiles?
At least, I think, 15 years after.
Amazing.
The missile crisis.
So secrets really can be kept.
Same thing about this. Yeah, think about this. You have to ask the question: how do we know what we know? And when it comes to major government initiatives or policies, decisions, we know what we know because we know what we were told.
Right.
And of course, we're always told a story, an explanation that makes, our country, look good. Now, this is true of every other country, too. I'm not saying we're unique in any way. But how do Americans know what they know about the American government decisions? It comes from the decisions. And then 10 years later, 20 years later, 40 years later, 50 years later, historians find documents that irrefutably explain that what we thought we knew was not true. And then they were accused of being revisionists, as if that's some kind of a dirty word. I mean, what is the point of doing history if you don't add something new?
Right.
I mean,
right.
You can't just tell the same story again and again and again and again.
Right.
So,
you mentioned
you know more later than at the time.
There was something in your book where you mentioned there was something still unknown and you were waiting for more Freedom of Information Act documents to be released, but they haven't been released yet. But now I forget what that was.
So do I.
I don't have a physical copy of your book. Unfortunately, I had to read it on the. Yeah. But that's true of everything, of course. And to be fair, there's probably good reasons why we don't need to know everything, right? I mean, I'm a strong believer in the free press, of course, and maybe what Snowden did is good because we didn't know what the government was doing in their surveillance program and these warrantless surveillance plans that were put into place, even with foreign leaders. Now we know, and that's good to know. But on the other hand, maybe we don't need to know everything because there's a lot of bad actors out there.
Well, yes, we don't need to know everything. I heard an interview last night with Chris Hedges, the journalist who was asked about, Snowden, and he said, no, not Snowden.
The other one. Yeah. Yeah.
WikiLeaks.
Yeah, the WikiLeaks guy, yeah.
And, he said he's the most important publisher of the 20th century,
Wow.
And, I mean, that's his view. He'd expose, these anti-democratic things that the United States government was doing. I mean, that's a different issue, of course.
Yeah.
Back to the nuclear issue. we need to know a lot more about um, the, uh, the nuclear, war plans, and in order to understand how crazy they are in this day and age.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, what are some of the deep lessons we can take from the Cuban Missile Crisis to apply to, say, the next administration? So let's say on January 21st, you get a call from Biden's people, and they say, Dr. Sherwin, we need your advice. We want to get to nuclear zero, or at least prevent Armageddon. What should we do?
Oh, well, okay. The first thing that I would tell them, you want to start simple, is recreate the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. And why would I say that? Because we talked about how bureaucracies, operate on their own. We need a bureaucracy that is committed to the idea of arms control and disarmament. We're talking about nuclear weapons here. So I would say recreate ACTA, number one. Number two, follow the early Obama. That the United States needs to commit itself to really leading the effort to not only minimize, but perhaps even get rid of nuclear weapons. Now, how do you do that? Well, the basic principle is that you would have to have an alternative substitute for what nations that have nuclear weapons believe their value is. Well, security, influence. Well, how do you develop an international system that provides those guarantees to Pakistan, to North Korea, to Israel, and so on, and so forth. So, there's no easy answer. I mean, and there's no quick solution, but there has to be a change in thinking, and there has to be a commitment to, getting rid of these weapons. And one of the ways to do it, to begin doing it, is to form and recreate this organization, the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, that was dedicated to dealing with this issue. It can't be just part of the State Department, because it just gets buried in there. It has to be a separate organization.
What about reinstituting the Iran nuclear deal? Should we do that?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Of course we should.
Yeah. I think that'll probably happen.
One of the best, and I think Biden is going to try to do that. It's not going to be easy, because now the Iranians have, this leverage, saying, you're coming back for this deal. It was just broken. Don't tell me it's a different administration. We're dealing with the United States. The United States made the deal. The United States broke the deal. Now the United States wants to recreate the deal. What are we, a yo-yo?
Right.
So it's going to be tough. It's going to be real tough.
Yeah, the assassination of the Iranian nuclear scientist, almost surely by Israel, I presume. I guess everybody knows without saying it. I guess that's better than launching nukes to stop their nuclear program. But boy, that's pretty risky.
It's risky, and it's worthless. The assassination of that scientist is in no way going to slow or seriously affect the Iranian program. Uh, and it's it's a very bad situation. The United States has to take charge of that again. We've just we abandoned it. I think Trump has done so much damage, both domestically and internationally, that a significant portion of that damage is irreparable. It cannot be repaired, but we have to try to repair as much as we can. We're like a ship in the middle of the ocean, that was hit by a torpedo. We've managed to patch things up and keep it afloat. We've got to make it back to port, and we've got to repair the ship completely.
Yeah.
Right now we're limping back to port.
Well, given what Iran has said about Israel and Jews in particular, I kind of see why Israel has nuclear weapons. I get that. Again, it's back to that kind of the logic of deterrence.
Yeah. Well, now we're coming full circle in our discussion.
Yeah.
You can understand it, but in the same way you can understand why Russia got nuclear weapons. You can understand why China got nuclear weapons. You can understand why India then got nuclear weapons, and then Pakistan then got nuclear weapons.
Right.
I mean, we could understand all these things, but all this understanding can lead to a nuclear holocaust.
Right.
So what good is all the understanding?
Right. Yes, and we're back to where we began with luck. This is not a good strategy for the long run. If you mentioned probabilities, if you carry this out for another half century or a century, something bad could very well happen.
Yeah, no, and I think will. So we need to take another fork in the road.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we can get there with more investment in game theory strategy for foreign and international relations, something like that. It's a human psychology problem as much as anything.
Yeah, spare me the game theory, please.
Okay. Enough of the Dr. Strangelove. It reminds me of I was going to ask you about the Kennedy and the missile gap. Kennedy, if I recall, he campaigned on the so-called missile gap, which turned out to be an illusion. And then that reminded me of the mine shaft gap in Dr. Strangelove, where they played out the scenario where almost everybody's dead, but a few of the chosen leaders get to go down and live in these mine shafts until the radiation is gone, but the Russians have more mine shafts than we have, so there's a mine shaft gap, and even that whole thing is, it's so.
We cannot.
That's right. Yeah. So much of that is based on false information. Sorry, Marty.
Yeah. Anyway,
yeah, Marty, we've been going we've been going an hour and a half, and I know you got to get going. It's late there, but I just want to thank you for your book. It's great, and just ask you what else you're working on, or what we can expect next.
Well, the next book I'm going to write, I'm looking into it. Is a story of a B-29 crew at the end of World War II that was shot down over Japan before Hiroshima, floated around in the Sea of Japan, and was picked up by Japanese fishermen, turned over to a POW camp. Were about to be executed. was saved, were taken to Hiroshima. They were the first Americans into Hiroshima, shown the devastation. It was all done by a Japanese military police captain who had been an exchange student at Dartmouth College in the 1930s.
Oh my God.
It's a fascinating story. And it's also a story about the bombing at the end of the war. And, it's uh, it's very exciting.
That's an incredible story. That would make a great screenplay and a film. Oh, I know. That's what I wanted to ask you about the film, the film 13 Days. I think you mentioned the book by Bobby Kennedy, which you hinted that was probably maybe not so accurate and maybe exaggerated his role in the thing. Is the movie 13 Days? Is it pretty accurate, or what would you say on that?
No, let me say two things about Robert Kennedy's book. It's filled with inaccuracies, especially the general view that he presents of his peacekeeping efforts. Number one, the 13 Days film is not accurate. However, and there's a big, debate among historians. It's awful because it's not accurate. I think it does the most important thing a film on the Cuban Missile Crisis can do. It shows you the tension and the danger that the crisis posed. Hollywood is not, an academic tenure meeting.
Right.
Historic accuracy. It's entertainment. Does it give you more or less the correct impression? The answer is yes, in my view. But it's filled with inaccuracies. And if you want to get the accurate picture,
read your book.
I humbly suggest
I do.
Read Armageddon.
That's right. Absolutely. I thought that they should make a new movie based on your book, because in any case, you can also those audio tapes are available, right? Yeah, hold your book up because I don't have a copy. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I love that cover. Yep. Gambling with Armageddon. Yeah, it's a great title. It's a great read. Marty, what a great book you've written, and I also recommend, of course, as my audience members knows, the audio version is really well read. The guy who reads the book for you is just fabulous. So it's a good read.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I've enjoyed the conversation.
I hope the book does really well. It's really important.